There's a man celebrated in Soviet culture who went by the name Valery Chkalov. This was a man who was known as the Birdman to many. He saw his first plane in 1919. To us, that's over 100 years ago and then some. And once he saw his first ever plane, he decided to join the Red Army's Air Force. Joining first at the age of 16 as a mechanic, he trained as a pilot at Yigorovsky Training School and graduated in 1924, joining a fighter squadron. In the early 1930s, he became a test pilot. His feats included doing 250 loop-the-loops in 45 minutes. I think for most of us, our stomachs churn at the thought of doing one. Valery Chkalov is remembered in Soviet culture and also North American culture, but probably not enough in global culture for the feats he achieved in the 1930s. In 1936 and 1937, he participated in several ultra-long flights, including a 63-hour flight from Moscow in the Soviet Union to Vancouver, Washington in the United States, via the North Pole in a Tupolev Ant-25 airplane between the 18th and the 20th of June 1937. A non-stop distance of 8,811 kilometers. That's 5,475 miles. The flight pioneered the polar air route from Europe to the American Pacific coast. He was planning the world's first non-stop flight around the planet when he sadly died. Well, as the birds enjoy this very regal, fine chap, this is Valery Chkalov. I hope I'm not brutalizing his name, but he was effectively one of Russia's original birdmen. He was the man that flew from Moscow all the way across the North Pole to Vancouver, and he was celebrated as Russia's hero in 1936. Well, not Russia's hero, the Soviet Union's hero in 1936. And the birds seemed to love him because obviously he was a man of the air. Sadly, in 1938, he had a disaster of an air flight, first test flight of a particular plane. Obviously that didn't go too well and sadly met his fate. What's interesting about Valery Chkalov, probably saying that completely wrong, and I'm sorry Valery, he is celebrated throughout the entire Soviet Union. This is Chkalov Square, and a beautiful square it is, a tiny little square, sort of in the northwest side of Kyiv, and down there we've got a little beautiful fountain where people sort of walk their dogs and men feed the pigeons. I just wonder, as his statue is so neglected, it kind of needs a lick of paint. Almost 100 years since his death, people still remember this fine chap. If you're curious, this is how the monumental flight began. June 18th, 1937 at 4:05 Moscow time. We find ourselves at Moscow Shlovenko Airport. There, an Ant-25 was headed for the North Pole. Crew commander was Valery Chkalov. The relief pilot and navigator and radio telegraphist was George Badukov, and navigator and radio operator Alexander Balyakov. The Ant-25 took off as planned. After 5 hours of flight, Chkalov discovered the leakage of oil, but he did not turn back. Sometime later, the leak had slowed. Their first cyclone was waiting for them over the European part of the country. The crew had to use the screw defroster and then gain a height of 3,000 meters. They were fighting with the threat of icing going down below the clouds and then rising above them. No less dangerous was the failure of the cooling system. At any moment, the engine could seize up. In a cramped and unpressurized cabin, temperatures dropped below zero, and at high altitudes, there was a shortage of oxygen. After a day of flight, the Ant-25 approached the North Pole. June 19th at 4 hours 15 minutes, polar explorers at the North Pole station heard the sound of engines and the aircraft flying over the North Pole. Meteorologists' assumptions that the central part of the polar basin, the top of the cloud, will not exceed 3,500 meters, had not confirmed. This created additional difficulties for the crew, obliging them to go up above the clouds. Over the Canadian part of the Arctic, the plane rose to 5,750 meters, making partly a blind flight. Ice plane was shaking, and the first time in a 37-hour flight they had to slow down the engine speed as much as possible, hoping to find safer layers of air. Ant-25 descended to an altitude of 3,000 meters and gave a level. They were running out of oxygen supply. Temperature in the cabin was close to zero. June 19th at 13:50, the crew reached the coast of Canada. From there, they turned to the west to overcome one more heavy obstacles, the Rocky Mountains. There came the most difficult part of the flight. Suffering from the lack of oxygen was getting stronger. They were flying blindly to overcome the cloudiness. Accompanied by icing, the aircraft was climbing to 6,100 meters. The temperature overboard was minus 20 degrees. June 20th, 40 minutes past midnight. They ran out of oxygen, but by the morning the Ant-25 was already flying along the ocean coast, taking radio signals from Anchorage, Seattle, and San Francisco. Due to the strong headwinds, they had spent more fuel than expected. Gasoline stocks did not allow to continue the flight to San Francisco, where the landing was scheduled. June 20th at 16:20, Chkalov's aircraft lands at an airport on the outskirts of Portland, Vancouver. Fuel in the tanks was almost gone. The crew completed the flight to Moscow, the Kola Peninsula, Barents Sea, Franz Joseph Land, North Pole, Melvin Islands, Island Banks, Pier Point, Queen Charlotte Islands, Vancouver, Portland. In 63 hours and 16 minutes, the aircraft flew over 9,130 kilometers, 8,582 kilometers in a straight line, which was approved as a national record of the Soviet Union. But the world record for the distance was not beaten. It was already made by the crew of another Ant-25. That day in 1937, America met Soviet pilots as heroes. Instead of the planned 15-minute conversation, President Roosevelt had spoken to the Soviet crew for an hour and 40 minutes. In New York, the pilots were offered a grand welcome in the streets. That was Valery Chkalov's biggest accomplishment and most famous accomplishment. And because of that, there are now parks and roads and buildings all over the old Soviet Union named after him. And because of that, I found myself in Chkalov Square in Kyiv.